Addis Business Talk with Khalid and Marid on Afro FM 105.3. We'll be talking to policymakers, investors, business leaders, and entrepreneurs to bring you the latest development taking place in the Ethiopian economic and business climate, and more importantly, what it means to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from Addis Ababa. This is Addis Business Talk with Khalid and Marid every Thursday morning on Afro FM 105.3. My name is Khalid Mawi, along with my co-host Marid Bisrat. Thank you everyone for joining us. This show is brought to you by Pragma Investment Advisory, an investment management and business advisory firm based here in Addis Ababa, along with our partners at 251 Communications, a prominent marketing and communications firm based in Addis as well. Now, our guest today is none other, of course, than Mamo Mihretu. Mamo, of course, is a senior policy advisor, chief trade negotiator, and secretary for the macroeconomic committee at the office of the prime minister. Mamo, a very warm welcome to the show, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation to appear on Addis Business Talk.
Thank you guys. Thank you for having me. It's great to be in your show.
Excellent. The pleasure is ours. Now, as we usually do, Mamo, we begin with sort of an introductory question. And so I would go ahead and ask you if you could tell us about your background, your previous work experiences, the studies that you have pursued, and the schools that you have attended. And if you could also please share with us the story of how you became the youngest senior economic advisor to the PM and the secretary for the macroeconomic committee at the Prime Minister's office. It's, I'm sure, quite a fascinating story. So please feel free.
Thank you so much, Khalid. Thank you for the questions. First of all, I might look young, but I'm not that young, so don't be mistaken. So, but just very, very briefly about my background. I graduated, almost more than a decade ago from Addis Ababa University School of Law faculty. So I was trained as a lawyer first. And immediately after graduation, I started teaching at the law school at Addis Ababa University, and also teaching at other colleges, private colleges in Ethiopia. And then after working for almost a year, at that time, most people go to do graduate studies, and I did the same. And I went overseas to do my graduate program in trade and investment policy. And I studied at University of Amsterdam and University of Pretoria. It was a sandwich program, but mainly focusing on trade and investment policy issues. And then after that, after completing my studies, came back to Ethiopia and decided to join the Ministry of Trade and Industry, mainly focusing on Ethiopia's trade negotiation, WTO negotiation, bilateral trade agreements. And at that time, I remember there was a very active negotiation between African countries and the European Union to initiate the free trade agreement. So I was the lead principal advisor on that for the Minister of Trade, basically focusing on trade and investment negotiation. And I did that for about 3 years. And then after that, I decided to, go and pursue my graduate degree. And I went to Harvard University, Kennedy School of in economic policy, in public policy, essentially. And I did that at the Kennedy School. That was really fantastic. I spent some time there. And after completing my studies, I joined the World Bank Group. I think that was I believe in 2010. And I worked at the World Bank Group, mainly based out of the Kenya office, leading the World Bank's group engagement in finance, competitiveness, logistics, investment policy, both in Ethiopia and in the region. So that's what I did. And there was, one of the works that I did for the bank, for the World Bank, was to initiate the Ethiopia Investment Climate Program. So we initiated that. We did some work in terms of simplifying the business licensing process, did some work on trade logistics, supported the Ethiopian Investment Commission. So we had a range of programs dealing with a range of private sector finance competitiveness issues. And before I joined this administration, I was leading one of the biggest, World Bank group engagement globally in terms of budgetary support. There was, I don't know if you heard from the news, but there was this, big, massive $1 billion budgetary support program. So
yeah.
I was one of the team leaders for that project. And, in the course of my interaction with the government offices, during that time, I was fascinated by the change that was happening in Ethiopia. And when the new administration assumed political power, I was invited to join the government. At that time, it was a very difficult decision for me. But I thought at that time I needed to answer the call to public service. I still believe public service is the most important and the highest calling. And I wanted at that time to be useful. So, I set aside my World Bank career and then joined the government. Now I'm part of this administration in trying to change things and trying to improve people's lives to the extent possible. So in brief, that's my background.
Wow, Ato Mamo, that's a very inspiring story. I mean, absolutely, I couldn't agree more. Public service is the highest calling, and serving your country is obviously the highest calling. Thank you for that. And so, as a member of Microeconomic Committee and a senior policy advisor, let's start our conversation by talking about the economic performance of last year and the first quarter of this year. I would say the Ethiopian economy has faced significant challenge due to the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic and also this menace of the locust invasion, as we are hearing on the news. How would you assess the country's economic performance of last year and first quarter, considering these two major setbacks?
Yes. Again, thank you. That's a really important question. I think first of all, let me start by saying a few things about the COVID-19 pandemic. I believe the COVID pandemic is the biggest challenge the world faces in living memory. I mean, it's unique. I think the first thing about COVID is that it's global, right? And second, it's more severe than a typical recession. And third, as we see it now, it has a longer durational impact. And the difficult thing about COVID is that it is not over until we found a vaccine or cure. So naturally, given that this is the biggest challenge that the world faces in living memory, it will naturally have a significant impact on any country's economy, and Ethiopia, of course, is not an exception. So the COVID pandemic affected our economy both in a direct and indirect way. Essentially, in any public health measure that we take would significantly reduce human activity. If human activity is reduced, then economic activity will significantly be affected. I mean, that's only natural. I mean, and also if you look at the Ethiopian economy, for example, there was a complete shutdown of the travel and tourism sector. And this naturally will have a negative impact on our economy. There was a significant reduction in FDI inflow. And also there is impact on our service export. But having said that, despite all this challenge, the economy has registered significant growth. The data from the Planning and Development Commission is that the real GDP growth this past fiscal year was about 6.2%. So if you compare Ethiopia's economic performance with other countries, it is actually remarkable. Despite the COVID pandemic, we were able to register significant growth. Of course, this is lower than the targeted 9%, but decent nonetheless, remarkable nonetheless. I think partly it's because of the way Ethiopia budget year is that COVID affected us in the last quarter of the fiscal year.
Yeah.
I think that also partly explains, why our economic performance is still quite positive. If we compare it with other countries, for example, the advanced economies, economy activity has shrunk significantly in advanced countries by almost 7%. So in that context, our growth performance was positive. So let me just give you a few figures, Marid, because I think it's very important to substantiate this claim. I think, first of all, agriculture, the core of our economy, has grown by 4.5% this past fiscal year. And it is an important contributor to the overall growth of the economy. Manufacturing, surprisingly, has also shown some growth, partly because we were able to repurpose our manufacturing firms to produce and supply masks and other medical supplies. So that agility, that quick decision to repurpose the manufacturing industry was helpful in the growth story. And another very clear indicator is the performance of the financial sector. If you look at the performance of the financial sector, it's remarkable because outstanding deposit liability has now reached 1 trillion Ethiopian birr by the banking system, and deposits this past year has increased by almost 16%. And last year alone, the total loan that was dispersed to the economy reached about 271 billion Ethiopian birr. And I'm sure your listeners would find this, very gratifying that, close to 70% of the credit actually went to the private sector. And if you compare it to last year, credit to the private sector has increased by 20%. So this, in short, will goes to show that the Ethiopian government is actually trying to support not just public investment, but rather productive private investment. As long as they're productive, they would benefit from increased access to finance. And just one last point, and I will stop. If you look at the performance of the export sector, again, despite the COVID, despite the COVID pandemic, our export last year reached $3 billion US. And by export, I'm mainly referring to export in trading goods, not services. So it reached 3 billion Ethiopian birr, 3 billion in US dollar, I'm sorry, which is a 14% increase compared to last year. And this is, again, for us, it's a sign of hope, partly because for the past 5 years, the performance of the export sector in Ethiopia has been declining. Last year, despite COVID, export has increased by 40%. And the good news is, even in the current fiscal year, if you look at the performance of the economy, of course, the final GDP, growth for the first quarter will be out in a couple of weeks. It's not yet ready, but if you look at the export performance, the performance of the export sector for the first quarter of this year has increased by 16%, even compared to last year. And this is mainly due to a better than expected performance of our gold export, which for the first time has outpaced coffee. So in short, just to answer your question, despite COVID, last year we had a very strong and growing economy. We've significantly improved our revenue tax collection. We had a healthy financial sector and a much more improved financial inclusion. And finally, we improved our export performance. So we were very much hopeful that we would do the same this year as well.
Absolutely, Ato Mamo. That's very encouraging numbers. I mean, despite the fear when the first time the pandemic hit the country, and right now things seems to be back to normal, and at the same time we have a very strong economic numbers. That's very encouraging to hear that. And at the same time, people seems to be moving on in terms of on the private sector things. People are starting to adapt how to live with the virus, and at the same time preventing protecting themselves in their day-to-day interaction. That's very encouraging. I mean, we are very helpful in terms of this year's number as well. So let's talk to the big news. I mean, Ethiopia, of course, in your lead, has started the discussion of the accession to join the WTO, the World Trade Organization. Of course, I think when the pandemic starts back in January, you led a high delegation team to relaunch the Ethiopia's accession to WTO. Tell us the main takeaway from the meeting, and who were the team you were leading, and what we have accomplished during that meeting. And I have a couple of questions. Let's start from this.
So very, very good, Merit. But I think before I talk about the negotiation in Geneva last January, I think it's very important for your listeners to understand the context for this. I think,
Please.
I really want to preface this by talking about our approach to trade policy in general. I mean, without that context, very, very difficult to talk about WTO accession alone. So for me, as we think about WTO accession from the get-go, we wanted to have a consistent and coherent trade policy in Ethiopia. By consistent, I mean, our trade policy should be in sync with our other policies, whether it is our homegrown economic reform plan, or industrial policy, or our diversification strategy. There has to be inherent inconsistency among the multiple policy initiatives that the government have. So that's what was one of the key thinking point that we have at that time. The second thing is, as we think about and as we negotiate WTO accession from the get, we said we need to have a coherent, not just consistent, but a coherent trade policy. By that I mean, what we do at multilateral level through WTO accession has to be consistent with what we do at regional level, at continental level. So our trade negotiation approach at multilateral level through WTO, at regional level, through East Africa, Horn of Africa initiatives, and at continental level through CFTA has to be coherent. It has to flow from the same principle and the same foundation. So that was the context that we approached, trade policy. As you know, trade is important because trade is not just about moving goods and services. Trade also diffuses the most tense relationship. Trade will lead to significant peace dividend. Countries that trade with each other do not go to war. And if you look at history, deep and integrated markets always generate prosperity. And I think this was the foundation for the new administration in approaching its trade issues. And I don't know if you hear our Prime Minister, His Excellency Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, his vision is to forge a close and closely integrated full regional integration. And as he always says, where minds are open to ideas and markets are open to trade. So closer regional integration is in the interest of Ethiopia. Closer regional integration generates prosperity. I think that is an important point to take to bear in mind as we think about WTO accession. Now, coming back to your question, yes, we held our fourth working party meeting in Geneva, and I led a team of government officials from Minister of Finance, Minister of Trade and Industry, Revenue, Attorney General. I mean, it's just a big delegation, and of course from the academia, from the university, from the private sector, to discuss Ethiopia's accession to the WTO. And this negotiation, the fourth working party meeting, took place after 8 years of inactivity, which of course was caused by pressing domestic political factors, which everybody knows about. So, to your question, I think it was a very important moment for us because it was an opportunity to resume WTO accession, and we basically reaffirmed Ethiopia's commitment and Ethiopia's interest to be part of the multilateral trading system like never before, because we consider WTO accession to be an important extension of our existing current domestic reform program. I mean, I can elaborate that a little bit further if you want me, but this was the context for the fourth working party meeting that was held in Geneva last January.
Wonderful, Mamo. I think you clarified. Thank you for actually, first of all, thank you for clarifying the context. And you're absolutely right. Like, when the trade flows, the guns start to shout. Right. That's I think this. The January meeting is very, very important, and thank you for clarifying the context. Just on a follow-up question, in your statement to the working party of the WTO, you mentioned that Ethiopia is working on a bilateral market access with 6 WTO members in Geneva. Just if you could mention those few countries, and also you also affirmed that you also stated that Ethiopia provide a revised goods offer which envisions all tariff lines to be bound on the day of accession. And also the initial service offer was submitted offering the market access to commit 10 service sectors. Tell us which service sectors we're talking about, and tell us which 6 countries you were discussing with back in Geneva.
Good questions, Merit. So first of all, I mean, what is the nature and context of WTO negotiation? Essentially, we focused on 3 issues. Number 1, there is a negotiation on what we call rules, the multilateral trading rules and systems. By that, I mean, if you want to be part of the WTO, by definition, you have to accept the multilateral trading rules. You have to abide by them. I think in that respect, if you look at Ethiopia's current existing trade investment regulations, for most part, they are consistent with existing multilateral trading rules. For example, there is an obligation to make your trade rules transparent and public. And as you know, in Ethiopia, all laws are officially gazetted. I mean, they're officially published. So there are these kind of rules that the multilateral trading system wants every member country to be part of, to abide by. And for most part, as I said, we do comply with them. So that was one element of the discussion and the negotiation. The second element of the negotiation is negotiation one what you call trade in goods. This essentially relates to the tariffs that you apply to imported goods coming from any member country. So, there, what we discussed, and I think this is a very important point, is that we say, and I think this is a requirement, if you want to be part of the WTO, then you have to commit on that we said we will bind our tariff. By bind, we are saying we will put a ceiling to our tariff. So we're not saying that we are reducing our tariff. What we are saying is we would set a maximum ceiling to the tariff that's applicable to goods coming from other countries. Now, the tariff binding could theoretically be way higher than the current applied tariff rate. To just illustrate this point, for example, if we are investing, let's say, a textile product coming from, I don't know, China, and if the tariff rate is 15%, in the context of WTO, what we are saying is we would put a maximum ceiling to it. We'll say, for example, on textile, we'll import a maximum of 30%. Although our applied tariff is 15%, we can say 30% will be the applicable tariff rate. So we call that tariff ceiling or bound tariff rate. So again, what I said in my statement was that we will bind the tariff that's applicable on goods coming into Ethiopian market. Remember, we're not saying we are reducing tariff. In fact, we are putting a higher ceiling than the applied tariff rate. So that is the second part of the negotiation. I don't know if I'm clear, but let me just finish, and then if you have a follow-up question, you can ask me. And the third aspect of this is what we call negotiation in trade and services. Here, the essential point is you would negotiate on the nature of the sectors, the type of sectors that you would allow investors to come and invest in Ethiopia. So this, in the WTO, we have what we call service classification. This includes, for example, the telecom services, the logistics services, the broadcasting services, the retail trade. We have list of service sectors. So basically, when you negotiate trade in services, you are saying, on this service sector, I would allow foreign investors to come and invest in Ethiopia in some shape or form. So the negotiation is in service offer. So what we said essentially is that we would not commit to reduce tariff, but we would put a tariff ceiling by protecting Ethiopia's current policy space. We would also more or less reflect the existing investment regulation, and through that we would also maintain prudent regulation, and that way we would facilitate our discussion with other member countries. So essentially the outcome of this would be essentially the essential and the central agenda for WTO accession negotiation. Now, you also asked, which country did you have a discussion with? So we had two levels of discussion. We have what we call a multilateral discussion, where we had discussion with more or less all member countries in a bigger hall, in a bigger forum, multilaterally. And that essentially relates to the negotiation relating to the rules. But we also had a bilateral negotiation with a few selected member countries. This includes, I might forget, I don't have all the list, but I think from memory, that includes the US, European Union. As you know, European Union stands as one unit when it comes to external trade relationship. We have UK, because UK is outside the European system now. We had a discussion with China, with Japan, with Taiwan. I think after we returned, we had a discussion with Russian Federation as well. So, we had discussion with almost 6 countries on both trading goods and trading services. I'm not going to go into details because I don't think the listeners will find that interesting. But I think in conclusion, what I would say is there's a lot of momentum, there's a lot of goodwill and good faith to support Ethiopia's membership to the WTO. I would come back to it, but you should know that Ethiopia is one of the few countries that is outside the multilateral trading system. It's one of the most important country and the largest economy that is outside the WTO system. So there's a lot of positive and constructive openness to engage with Ethiopia in good faith to accelerate Ethiopia's accession to the WTO. Let me stop that, and then maybe I will address your follow-up questions.
Excellent, Mamo. Thank you very much for that granular and definitely insightful answer. I think this is a pretty common question moving forward, remaining within the WTO conversation. Of course, Ethiopia has been going back and forth with the accession process for an extended period of time. And I would say, fortunately, we have relaunched the process now. Because you hold such a relevant position in this conversation, why would you say such a long period of time has taken for this? And of course, as your position as chief trade negotiator, can you outline for us the major benefits that Ethiopia can take advantage from by joining the WTO?
Yeah, thank you, Khalid. So first of all, I think, our accession negotiation should not have taken this long. I think part of it is because of the domestic political difficulties that we faced over the course of the past couple of years. That kind of made us not to focus on this kind of important but not so urgent tasks. So we were constantly distracted by other issues, not least political issues. And now you asked about really important question about the benefit of WTO. I think we should. I think this is very important, and I think your listeners should also I think it's fair that people ask that question. I think first of all, let me say this: almost every country in the world is either a WTO member country or wants to be. And as I said before, only a few countries are outside of it. And perhaps the biggest economy outside WTO now is Ethiopia. I mean, the rest are maybe Eritrea, South Sudan, Somalia. Iran is not a member partly because of political issues, intractable political issues, sanction, and all that. And Sudan, of course. Other than that, most countries are members of the WTO. Now, whether you like it or not, the existing WTO rules are applicable on any country because all the other countries are part of the multilateral trading system. Indirectly, we are currently governed by WTO rules. So let's not forget that. Now, it's true that currently there's a lot of questions, and in my view, legitimate questions about the relevance of WTO, and that's being questioned in different corners, not least by President Trump. But we believe, despite its weaknesses and imperfections, WTO has a lot of benefits to countries like Ethiopia. Let me just say 3 points, and then maybe there are more, but I will, in the interest of time, I would emphasize on 3 points. The first is, when you join the WTO, you are essentially increasing your secure market access for our exporters, for our exports, whether service export or goods export. We will have secure, predictable market access, predictable external market access. Now, people here might ask, listen, we have, for example, AGOA to the US. We have this everything but arms scheme to European Union. What, so we don't need WTO if you have that kind of region. But the problem is, that kind of preferential trading arrangement is subject to prevailing, diplomatic and political winds. Khalid, let me just say this. Maybe I shouldn't say it, but I think if, for example, one of your, trading partners, either in Europe or in the US, decided to withdraw their current preferential regime, what would be the fate of Ethiopia's exporters? I think, it's very important to think about that. So what WTO does is essentially transform a trade policy environment that is characterized by unilateralism, unpredictability, into one that is secure and rule-based. Once you become WTO member country, your preferential market access would be legal, they would be secure, they would be predictable, and that creates an important, secure trading environment for our exporters and traders. So that's the first benefit. The second benefit is, when you negotiate WTO agreement, it also serves as an important and useful anchor for domestic reforms. So particularly, for example, I mentioned before, WTO rules promote transparency, WTO rules promote progressive reforms. And through that process, there is significant learning. And through that learning, you could translate your existing reforms into meaningful external arrangements that will be really difficult to reverse at a later point. So it actually is seen as a useful anchor for really good, sound domestic reforms. But the third thing is, when you become a WTO member country, essentially you are enhancing your international reputation by becoming WTO member country. You are saying to investors that you are open to trade and investment, and this will significantly stimulate investment. And that has been the experience of other upstream countries, particularly China. China significantly transformed, particularly their textile export, clothing export, transformed after they become WTO member, because on the back of that, they were able to attract significant investment. And frankly, if you look at the current, membership structure, if you are not member of the WTO, you carry this tenth of second-class citizenship in global community. You're not open to business. You're somehow, conflict-affected country. So So that's also, it's also a way of enhancing your reputation. And finally, I mean, just to be very brief on this, it will also give you access to the WTO dispute settlement mechanism. And you can go to WTO as a matter of right and take any other country that took any unfair trade measure against you for a binding dispute resolution. And finally, and because Ethiopia is a very important country, you know, Ethiopia's tradition is multilateralism. Ethiopia's foreign policy tradition is multilateralism. As a big country, as an emerging country, Ethiopia should also play an important role in shaping global trade rules. We cannot just simply sit and be a passive recipient of rules that are issued and made and formulated by other countries. You know, we need to be active in terms of our engagement. And by becoming WTO member, we will have that opportunity. So in short, I would say Ethiopia's economic relation with the external world is too important to be left to a maze of arbitrary, shifting, unstable preferential arrangement. When we join the WTO, we'll essentially, you know, translate this into a more predictable environment, and will also signal to the international investment community that we are finally open to trade and investment.
Yeah, definitely a very interesting and wide-ranging outline there, and these are all incentives that countries like Ethiopia should definitely embrace and embark on. And I think one of the last points you've mentioned as well about Ethiopia playing that proactive role to be part of the global value chain, I think it's about time. So I cannot agree more on that in that regard as well. I think you've mentioned recently that Ethiopia is ready for a deal and wants to complete this accession process within the shortest possible period. Ideally, not later than the end of 2021. I'm just curious how COVID-19 has affected perhaps the deliberation towards the WTO accession.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's a bit of an ambitious timeline, Khalid. And of course, you know, COVID didn't help because, you know, often in trade negotiation happens in, you know, physically. You know, you go there, you know, because you know, have bilateral discussion, bilateral meetings, and because of that, we now are, you know, trying to manage through virtual meetings. But you know, be that as it may, and we are you know, currently trying our best to do our part in terms of, for example, putting together replies to the questions from member countries to advance the process forward. But of course, you know, our ambition is to finalize it as soon as possible. But everything depends on the outcome of the negotiation. You know, there could be a few sticking points that you face along the way, and that might significantly delay the process. But we want to stay the course, and we want to push as much as we can. And frankly, you know, we are doing this not because we feel WTO membership is an end in its own, but because, as I said, it's a natural continuation of our domestic reform program. You know, we didn't reform the telecom sector because we want to be a member of the WTO. We reformed it because we feel it's important. And by doing that, we're also facilitating WTO membership process, and that's how we think about it.
Wonderful, Mamo. Just briefly, I mean, like on the trade aspect, there's a lot of news. Also, Ethiopia has ratified the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is a very significant step and a very encouraging step in terms of foster the Africa trade. And it's very important that we see Ethiopia being one of exemplary countries leading the conversation, also implementing it. Just to see it from your perspective, I think as African continent, I think also as a country, we need to address one key things. One of it is infrastructure investment. I think I'm seeing in recent reports that Africa needs about close to about $90 billion of infrastructure investment annually. That's a very serious investment. How do you think the Africa Free Trade, Continental Free Trade Agreement will work without investing in this critical infrastructure gap in terms of power, roads, and railways? How do you think Ethiopia can address it, and how do you think the continent can address it in order to foster this inter-Africa trade?
Now, I think that's important, very important point that you are raising. But my answer to your question is that why should it be one or the other? I mean, it's very, very critical to invest in infrastructure, whether it's power, road infrastructure, logistics, or port. That is a very important component of regional integration, trade integration. But in parallel, you also need to work in terms of harmonizing your trade relationship. You need to create really one single African market. So it's not just either or. I think it's something that you should pursue in parallel, and together I think it will have significant impact. Now let me just, because this is also an important platform for me, let me one thing I would say about the safety is that this is also remember, like initially to your first question, I told you that our strategy is to follow a coherent and consistent trade policy, right? Yep. So at Africa level, we pursued the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and by the way, this is the first free trade agreement that Ethiopia ever signed. And also, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is the second largest free trade agreement globally. And you know what? Yeah. It becomes a reality because of Ethiopia's support. If Ethiopia didn't sign and ratify the CFTA, it wouldn't have the reputation that it has currently. Because by being part of the CFTA, we are actually saying Ethiopia, a country of 100 million people, would be willing to put its weight to create one single African market. And we, I believe we played significant leadership role in that regard. And it also advances our national economic interest. Because if you look at current inter-regional trade in Africa, close to 80% of our, 80 or 90% of our export targets the rest of Africa. And if you look at the import structure, only 5% of our import comes from the rest of African countries. Most of that is petroleum and fertilizer, particularly from Morocco and in the neighboring countries. So frankly, by pushing the safety, you are actually creating a market opportunity of almost 3 trillion combined GDP to Ethiopia's exporters. And when you have that kind of market, it would be easier for you to attract investment because companies can relocate to Ethiopia and produce and sell not only in Ethiopia but also in other African countries. So it's a very important factor in terms of stimulating additional investment in Ethiopia. So it is consistent with our economic interest. There is a significant positive welfare impact. And by the way, it's also consistent with Ethiopia's traditional Pan-Africanist foreign policy objective, because Ethiopia for a long time stood for African renewal. So it's a very important work that we did in terms of advancing the safety. And as you said, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't really focus on other issues such as power, road infrastructure and logistics. And we are doing that actually. If you look at the Horn of Africa initiative, mainly the objective is to really invest in joint infrastructure project, whether it's in port or energy or irrigation or railway or power. So that is something that we're pursuing at the same time, in short.
Interesting, Mamo. Trying to sort of push forward with the same narrative behind what kinds of questions are raised by the devil's advocates usually. Circling back to the WTO, some would argue this also involves economists and other professionals in trade policy. Opening the market now could lead to a loss of power because we are not yet competitive. That's sort of the suggestion that they have, and saying that Ethiopia, of course, should probably strengthen its market position by using current preferential agreements like the ones you mentioned earlier, the African Growth and Opportunities Act, and the Common Market of Eastern and South Africa, before actually becoming a full member of the WTO. What would be your answer to these concerns, and are these really fair concerns in the first place?
You know, it's very important to make a distinction between liberalization and deregulation. It's very also critical to make a distinction between tariff binding and tariff elimination. People often refer to policy space because they assume that WTO membership will lead to countries and force them to eliminate their tariff. But as I mentioned before, that is far from the truth. And what we are discussing, what we are negotiating, is not tariff reduction. It's actually tariff ceiling. So we could maintain our existing policy space. The most important point is to actually conduct the negotiation in an informed fashion. So whatever policy space that people talk about, you can actually preserve. The second thing is people often confuse liberalization with deregulation. That you open up in a particular sector doesn't mean that you would deregulate that sector. You could achieve important policy objective through regulatory means, while somehow opening up the market for competition. And the third thing is, the way you liberalize has different shapes and forms. It's not like it's something that's black and white. There are different shades of gray. So depending on the sector and depending on your policy objectives, you could pursue multiple objectives at the same time. So in short, this notion of policy space and narrowing the policy space comes from an understanding that trade negotiation leads to tariff elimination, and trade negotiation brings about or ties the government somehow not regulating a particular sector. So I think that misconception needs to be clarified. Khalid.
And this is exactly why we have you on the show, Mamo. Some of these intricacies and complexities behind trade policy need to be clarified, and I hope that was done with that particular answer. Now, a few weeks back, the Ethiopian shipping lines has been announced that it won't be privatized anymore. There's a general impression that there are logistical issues faced by the dependency on one national shipping agency. And so really the question is, would potential accession to the WTO and the revamp of Ethiopia's efforts to take more advantage of the existing preferential trade agreements be hindered by this, some would say, surprising announcement?
So I think, first of all, WTO accession, doesn't require in any way privatization of state-owned enterprises.
Right.
WTO doesn't force you to privatize a state-owned enterprise, whether it's Ethiopian Shipping and Logistic Enterprise or Ethiopian Airlines, or for that matter, Ethiopia Telecom. WTO doesn't have any concern as to the ownership of a particular business entity. It could be private or it could be public. I think the most important thing is, whoever owns that particular business has to, abide by market rules. I think that's an important discipline, and I think that whether you are a member of WTO or not, I think that is an important principle to live by. Now, coming back to the issue of SALC, I think you should look at the broader objective of logistics sector reform. Privatizing ASLC was not the end from the get-go. I mean, the most important objective was to reform the logistics sector. And the reason why we are reforming the logistics sector is because we want to make the economy competitive. The logistics sector has to play its role, one, as an important source of growth, because the logistics sector is an industry. So the industry should be an important source of growth for the economy. But the second thing is, the logistics sector should also support and enable other sectors, for example, like the manufacturing sector. So the important goal of the logistics sector reform is, and I would underline this, to reduce transit cost and transit time and improve reliability in the logistics system. That was the important objective of the reform. Now, if people agree on the overriding objective of the reform, then how you achieve that is of secondary importance. Now, if achieving that objective requires us to allow more private logistics operators in Ethiopia, in addition to Ethiopian Shipping and Logistics Enterprise, then definitely we'll do that. If reducing the logistic cost require us to consider and explore the possibility of the Ethiopian Shipping and Logistics Enterprise working in joint partnership with other companies, logistic companies, whether they're domestic or foreign, then that's something that we'll consider. So again, back to the previous point, it wasn't, the decision, and I think the recent announcement, it was not really something silent. That was always implied in our reform effort. We have never said we would privatize ASLC for its own sake. We said we would consider any option that would transform the logistics sector, that would reduce trade the cost and transit time. And if it requires us to have more private sector participants, then that's something that we'd consider. So I think whatever statement that you're quoting should be seen in that context.
Thank you for clarifying that, Ato Mamo. I think it needs to be addressed, and thank you for that clarification. I think moving on, I think we're about to finish our time on a lighter conversation. Let's talk about the book that you helped edit, titled "Ethiopian in the Wake of Political Reform." Tell us about that book.
Yes, I mean, I should have. Perhaps I should have started with this, because this is really important for me, because
yes,
I have to plug in my book, right? So
yeah,
no, this is the book that we edited with two other Ethiopian academics. It's a rich and insightful collection of 20 chapters grouped under 4 thematic areas. So we discuss Ethiopia's political reform, economic reform, and we talk about federalism and nation building, and foreign and security policy. And the idea of the book project was to examine independently, impartially, and with absolute freedom the kind of sweeping reforms that the current administration took a year after it came to power and introduced, as I said, these sweeping political reforms. And our objective was to place the reforms in their broader historical and geopolitical context, and evaluate the direction taken in the first year of the change process. And as I said, the contributors of the books are all academics, researchers, and practitioners with acknowledged expertise in fields such as history, politics, economy, and foreign policy. So it's really important book that describes, analyze, as I said, objectively, freely, and impartially, and with an academic rigor, the comprehensive reforms that this government initiated a year after it came to political power. So, I mean, I can't go, beyond this regarding the book, but what I would say is, the book now is in the market. You can find it at Sheraton and Hilton, in Book World. It's really an important contribution, and I think on our part, a modest contribution dedicated to understanding, conceptualizing, and explaining the nature, the pace, and the direction of the current political transition in Ethiopia. You can find more in the book, and I hope you guys will get a copy and maybe read it a little bit and make it a subject for one of your programs in the foreseeable future.
We would love to, absolutely. We would love to. I think our listeners listen that, and I'm sure they will get it too. But this is going to be our final question, Ato Mamo. What would be the priorities of the Ethiopian government in the coming year? What can the private sector expect?
No, I mean we've been saying this for a while. I mean, so I would say we have short time, but I would say we have 3 priority areas, right? So the first thing, we want to address current macro financial vulnerability. So maintaining a prudent macro financial system is one important strategic priority for the government. Second thing is we would do additional measures to continue with the work of structural reform. So currently, as I initially mentioned, there's a reform on the telecom sector. Of course, I'm sure we covered it. This plan to issue 2 additional licenses will be accelerated. We are also undertaking logistics reform. We are in the middle of a power sector reform. We are also reforming the rail sector in Ethiopia. So all these are structural reforms that we are currently pursuing, and also improving the investment climate, and the private sector will find more useful. And the third thing is we would strengthen our diversification effort. We would launch new sources of growth. But of course, agriculture will always be an important area of focus, and we are currently finalizing a revamped, renewed agricultural policy. We are also working on addressing the constraints that the manufacturing sector is facing, and we are having a series of meetings this past couple of weeks to really understand, the barriers, the constraint that the private sector faces in terms of scaling up production. You'll see more work on the mining sector. And of course, tourism will always be an important priority sector, particularly, for the government. And I'm sure that you've seen the fantastic work that the Prime Minister is doing. And that would be very important in terms of launching new sources of growth. So in short, macro financial vulnerabilities will be addressed. We would pursue aggressively structural reforms. We would diversify the economy, and in the process, we would also create more space for the private sector in terms of access to finance, in terms of improving the investment climate, in terms of creating a secure external market, so that the overall competitiveness of the economy would significantly improve. And I think when that happens, of course, the most important thing is we will have better and more jobs for our youth, and of course, the underlying the major objectives of the government is to improve the living standard of our public, and we hope we'll do more work in that regard.
Thank you, Ato Mamo. I think that's encouraging to hear that the government is working on key areas, and we wish you all the best. So on that note, Ato Mamo Mihretu, Senior Policy Advisor, Chief Trade Negotiator, and Secretary of Microeconomic Committee at the Prime Minister's Office, it was a pleasure and honor to have you on Addis Business Talk to discuss about and to address key issues in Ethiopia's accession to World Trade Organization, also to talk about the Continental Free Trade Agreement. And I have to mention, and I have to recommend our listeners to talk about the book he edited, Ethiopia in the Wake of Political Reform. We highly suggest our listeners to read it. And thank you, Ato Mamo, again, and we wish you all the best in your efforts.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
Thanks. Thanks.
Addis Business Talk.